Live from the PeopleForward Network podcast studio at CultureCon in Madison, Wisconsin, this Fringe episode was created to help you grow your perspective around culture and meaningful work. CultureCon believes that every individual, regardless of role, has the power to make work more meaningful for themselves and their organization. Now, here's some inspiration straight from the amazing leaders and workplaces within the CultureCon community.
Bryetta Calloway.
Hello, hello.
I have been waiting for this conversation because I could not see you live today.
I know.
Because our presentations were scheduled at the same time.
They were. It was a universal oopsie because I for sure wanted to be attendee in yours. And when I heard that from you, I was like, so same.
Yes. So I really want to get into it because I really want to hear all about meritocracy, and marginalization.
Yeah.
Bridging the divide in the workplace.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like if I had fire emojis to drop, that title alone deserves fire. Before I even heard you say a word, I was all in. So tell us all about it.
Well, the one thing I'm so proud of, I'm a marketer by trade, so we love alliteration.
Yes.
So the 3 M's really satisfy my soul in a very real way. But, you know, what I didn't get a chance to talk about in there is sort of how I came to this topic. So for me, like a lot of things that I spend a lot of time researching, this came out of my own personal experience. Right. I've worked for a lot of amazing organizations. I've consulted for a lot of amazing organizations. And there is this moment where you're like, something is broken here, but I don't have language for that. And as a communicator, as a self-identified nerd, I'm like, if I don't have language for something, I have to go seek it out.
We are really people.
Yes,
that's all I'm going to say, but keep going.
Yes, because for me, it's like, and I talked about this in the session. I'm like, you know, a lot of times the biggest barrier to solving something is we don't even agree on what the problem is, right? So let's actually articulate the problem and understand if we're seeing this the same way. And so for me, what this session is about is that there is this ideal, right? That if you work really, really hard and you're skilled, that you really do have equitable access to things like job opportunities, growth, promotion, et cetera. And, you know, my caveat for this is, by and large, that is relatively true, right? Like there is a level of growth that marginalized folks can access in America, in most Western countries, that you probably could not have other places. And yet there is still a barrier to this idea, well, I'm working really hard. I feel like I'm skilled. Why am I not grasping the growth and the promotion? And so then what I noticed is that we spend so much time talking about bias and all of the isms, racism, misogyny, all of the things. But to me, there's actually a more nuanced one. And this is where this concept of meritocracy comes, where you start to notice that the folks holding power have these similar traits, right? And that could be race, that could be gender, but a lot of times it's much more nuanced than that. You'll see an organization where all of the leaders went to Yale, or like all of the real decisions happen on the golf course because they all play golf, or they smoke cigars. So when they're out smoking cigars, that's when they really start to make the deals. And it's like, well, I don't do any of those things. And so I'm excluded from where power and growth happens. And then if you layer on top of that all of the barriers due to race and gender, it becomes even more complicated. And so that's really what the work is about, helping people to understand that the work isn't finished just when you start talking about inclusion of different races, of different ethnicities, of different genders, that a lot of cultures have these unspoken guidelines for what it means to be a leader. And it's really helpful for people to be able to articulate that, notice that, so that they can actually solve it.
Oh, my goodness. I'm like, I don't even know where to start. But I will say this, because I want to be clear that that brilliant word that you're using, the root word is mirror.
Yes.
Meaning a reflection
Yes.
of oneself.
That's exactly
And so
right.
I just think it's so important to say that for people who are just listening and may not be able to hear
The nuance
that
between the words.
nuance.
Yep.
It's so powerful. And I will actually share a personal experience where I was in an interview cycle going incredibly well, gotten all kinds of wonderful feedback, and I wasn't invited to go to the final round. And the people didn't necessarily have real feedback, but they did, because what they said to me was, well, the male person who was interviewing you, I think they saw themselves in the person that they invited to go forward.
Yeah.
And the fact that they didn't even realize that actually was the feedback.
That's all the feedback I needed.
Is all I needed. And I was like, good, great, thanks. And I know this story.
Yes.
I've known this story. And I also think what's really powerful about what you said is that it's not, it does say that there is access, yes. And yes, there is progress, yes. And it also makes that vertical trajectory that we think our careers go on really bumpy.
Really bumpy, really long. It elongates the process. And I think for me, the biggest thing, I've spent the last 4 years interviewing hundreds of, what I would categorize as historically marginalized workers. So the thing that I can say is like, yes, it makes it really bumpy to ascend. It elongates the process. But the biggest thing for me is the dissatisfaction, right, of the process. Because again, there are all of these rules and I really find synergy with this because I tend to be a rule follower, right? I'm a firstborn kid. I actually grew up in a military family. Like everything's about rules. So I'm like, just tell me the rules. I will follow them. And when you do that and you don't see equitable growth, the level of dissatisfaction that happens is really, really clear. And one of the statistics that I was talking about in the session is like, when you start to see stats that Black and brown workers leave their roles 2 times as quickly as their non-POCs, there's something happening to that. Or when you look at post-COVID, the group that was most resistant to coming back to work were people of color, right? Because they're saying, well, I actually survive better when I don't have to deal with microaggression and the fact that like Ted's going to say that weird thing in the meeting that's going to offend me. And so those are some of the things that we have to think about because, to your point, the feedback that you got, it's like, well, we are reacting to the fact that you are feeling separate. And a lot of organizations take that as a criticism. Right? They're like, well, why don't you want to go bowling with us? And why don't you want to come to dinner? It's like, well, I don't reflect this group. And you're telling me that it's either reflect you or stay on the fringes. And one of the things that I said in the session, and one of the things I say a lot is, I think my biggest problem with DEI work is that it's out of order, right? We focus so much on diversity. We want different people in the room, which is great. And equity, we want to give them a seat at the table. That's fantastic. But if we really don't do the work of making them feel included, why invite them to these spaces? You're inviting, dissatisfaction, in some cases, real trauma to the individual and to the organization. And then I'm an executive, so I think about things like the reputational risk for our organization, what happens when we're labeled a non-inclusive work environment. Like there's a lot of risk to the idea that if you're not really willing to open your culture to other people, then you really have to ask yourself, is it worth it to lean into this diversity work, into this equity work?
Yeah. Like when you said trauma, I wanted to say that part, right? Because I think that the reality also is that people also don't realize the harm they are inflicting on people. And they're carrying those burdens. And so that dissatisfaction that you're talking about becomes so real.
Yeah, the word trauma is a very deliberate word. So another sort of hot take that I have is I really don't like when people frame things as like workplace trauma. It's like, well, it's trauma regardless, right? Like if you were walking down the street and someone said something really hurtful to you, you wouldn't say sidewalk trauma. or grocery store trauma. No, it's trauma. And it happened to happen in the workplace. And one of the things that I do in this session is because, again, I've interviewed so many people. I have like 2 minutes of an interview where I speak to this person. We call her Rachel for the sake of her anonymity. And she shares her story of workplace trauma. And I really work with the audience to ask them, what do you think her journey is over the next 18 months? And I let the audience sort of step into that space of what does it feel like to actually empathize with someone in this position? Because the truth is, we don't all have the same point of reference. Right? You don't understand what it's like to be a woman. You don't have to, right? You may not understand what it's like to be Black or to be queer or to be a single mom. Like, you don't have to understand that, but you know what it's like to be hurt. And can you tap in to that feeling just enough to say, oh, I get it. Maybe not fully, but I actually understand what happened to you, so that you can actually deal with it in a way that honors what really happened, not checking a box to say, well, you guys, don't treat her like that anymore. But like to really understand that for some folks, they are carrying around real trauma as a result of these interactions. And it's funny because I was looking at this report from American Express. They were talking about the uptick in entrepreneurs being Black women. And they were like, this is really exciting. I'm like, well, it is exciting, but it's a direct response.
That's right.
It's a direct response to the fact of like, I don't want to work in these spaces anymore. I would rather work for myself.
Yeah, they're using their agency to opt out.
That's exactly right.
And it's interesting because when you were talking about the resistance to return to work, I immediately thought of the New York Times article that talked about specifically why Black women are thriving better back then, right? Within the COVID protocols, because they could be at home and they didn't have to deal with all of the microaggressions. But you also talk about something else that I think is really important in I think of this work around empathic intelligence. And, a couple of things come to mind. When people share their story, believe them, right? That comes to me. But it's also, one of the things we talked about in my presentation, which we'll talk about later too, is this idea of being open to learn, open to hear another story, open to be changed by the story that they share. And what I've seen firsthand in culture transformation work that I've done in the past is that it's in that story sharing
100%
that you see lives transformed
100%.
That you cannot control, but you see it when one person is courageous enough to share their story and then it lands on a heart and all kinds of things can open up and create that connection that wasn't there. And to your point, you don't have to have the lived experience that I've had, but you've heard my story and it landed somewhere. And now you get to, as I like to describe it, is you open the aperture through which you see now.
Yes.
And that's the beauty of the exchange in the first place.
I double click on so much of what you're saying because I always talk about the fact that I came to research sort of accidentally. I really consider myself to be a storyteller, right? I'm really passionate about stories. And so for me, what unlocked my passion for research was, and it sounds silly, but it was a real aha moment for me. I was like, oh, this data, these are people's stories.
Yes.
Right? Like when we say these numbers, like, 84% of women feel that their ideas aren't valued. That means in a room of 100 women, 84 of those women feel like they have a story where they can tell you, I tried to give an idea and no one listened to me. No one took me seriously. Like when you frame it,
horribly high percentage.
It's a really interesting way to think about it. And so I think you're right. Again, as a marketer, we understand that emotions drive action, right? Like that's what branding is all about. We want you to understand what we offer and we want you to be driven by your love of that, your sense of connection. It's the same thing with change, right? Like people are willing to change based off of how it makes them feel. And this is one of the things that I often think about when you're talking about culture change and actually bridging the divide. A lot of folks, in my opinion, misunderstand allyship. They think that allyship is I will act on behalf of the marginalized person or community. But real allyship is when you are moved by what happens, right? Like that you don't have to be a person of color to be offended by racism. And you don't have to be queer to be offended by homophobia, right? Like it should actually offend you. And then out of that offense, you're like, wait, that can't be our culture here. We can't talk to people this way. And it actually doesn't matter what you think, person of color. I'm telling you, I don't want to work in an environment like that. Like when you are able to unlock that, first of all, that's culture change at scale.
Yeah.
But two, it also takes the pressure off of marginalized groups to constantly have to advocate for themselves, which, and we talk about this in the session, it's all of that unspoken, invisible emotional labor that they have to carry. It's like, not only do I have to meet my deadlines and like do my work and clock in and clock out, I also have to be pleasant because I don't want to be an angry Black woman, right? I also have to be super helpful because I can't be seen as not a team member. And now I've got to educate everyone on what microaggression is, right? And I've got to speak up for myself. That's a lot of extra work. So when we start to question, well, why are people so burnt out? We're just asking them to like do the work. It's like, well, I'm working 3 jobs between 9 to 5, right? This job, educating you, and like self-management, emotional management. So yeah, I think that's the part where, to your point, if people can have an emotional step in, a lean in where they say, there's something about that story where like, I may not know that, but I know what it's like to feel like an outsider. I know what it's like when someone said something that was hurtful. I know what it's like to be embarrassed at work or to feel shame at work. And those moments of connection help people lean in a little bit more to say, okay, now I think I'm understanding more of your story and what you're saying.
Yeah. I want to ask a question because I'm so inspired by everything that you've said. I literally everything you've said has been my lived experience. And when I think of the resistance sometimes that people face, and, you know, I talk about inner work a lot, the inner work that as leaders, as humans, we do to be able to keep moving through this life when we run into difficult things and challenges. And when we brush up against another one's lived experience, how that can impact us to change as well. But I feel like what we hear a lot in our culture these days is the pushback. I actually don't want to hear all of that because it creates shame for me.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious through this lens of this brilliant presentation, if you've encountered that or if you've thought about, you know, or have what you articulate about that.
I love that you say that because, you know, there's sort of 2 schools of thought that I have about resistance. The first one is this a natural reaction to lack? And what I mean by that is I'm self-aware enough to know I don't have the skills to do that, which makes me really afraid of this, right? So I don't know how to do this well. And I actually find a lot of synergy with that thought. You know, again, firstborn child, I'm a perfectionist. Like if I don't think I can get it right, I actually don't want to do that, right? So I try to suss out, is this resistance based on lack of skill, right? Because that's easy to solve, right? Let's give you tools and resources. Is the resistance because it creates too much responsibility on me? And that sense of responsibility, again, is not necessarily a bad thing. That means you understand the gravity of what's happening, but can we call you into this conversation to understand what responsibility and action actually looks like? And then to your question about the shame piece, it's interesting because I start the presentation with this exercise that I call the mirror test. And I just ask people to raise their hands if they see themselves in a description. So raise your hand if you're sitting next to someone who has the same hair texture as you. Raise your hand if you're within 1 inch of height to the next person next to you. Raise your hand if you've ever been ignored in a room, right? Like, so that people can understand that these moments happen to a lot of folks. But it's so that we can begin the conversation by saying that this idea of wanting to find sameness doesn't necessarily mean that you're a bad person, that you're racist, misogynist. It doesn't mean that. It's actually human nature. It's what helps us survive, right? We look for sameness because that means safety, right? So what we want people to do is recognize it. Recognize that this is a natural tendency. I even talk about my own bias that I have. You know, I went to an Ivy League university, and so I tend to have a bias towards people who are college educated. I sort of feel like, well, you'll get it. Right? Because like, I get it, so you'll get it, and because we're the same, right? Like, it's natural. It doesn't mean that I'm a bad person, that I would willingly treat someone poorly. And I think helping people reframe this conversation sort of takes the air out of this shame scenario. The other thing that I do, and I talk about this a lot, because again, if you're going to think about this as trauma, it's really important that you don't center your shame in the conversation, right? And we've all actually been here, right? Like, you did something to offend your friend and your friend is really hurt. And next thing you know, the whole conversation is about how sorry you are and how you didn't really mean to do that. And like, let me explain. And it's like, well, now this is all about you.
That's right.
Like, and absolving you. It's like, can you sit in discomfort? Can you just sit in it? You don't have to know the right things to say. Can you just sit in this moment? And let me say to you, this was really hurtful for me. Truthfully, you can't change it. The moment has happened, right? The interaction has happened. But I think that's the other thing. I often try to invite people to say, like, you actually don't have to have the answers. And the truth is, there's no one answer fits all scenarios. But can you sit in discomfort? Can you not center your emotions in this? Can you accept responsibility for the fact that whether you do something or not, you have a role in this, some role in this process? And then can you just be honest about when you don't know something, right? Which I think is the biggest thing, especially for leaders. Leaders never want to say, I don't know how to deal when someone comes to me with that, because then we can give you tools and resources and language. So some of those things are what I try to do in order to help people with the shame barrier.
Yeah. I wrote a piece once about the anatomy of an apology. And the big piece is, can you get to the desire for repair and recovery?
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, that's that if the goal is to deal with your shame versus the goal really is to repair and recover the harm that has been done, can we just focus on that goal?
Yeah. And can we be honest about that?
Yeah.
I love that. It's so interesting because I was just having a conversation with someone in my personal life about this. And, you know, they're having this interpersonal conflict. And I just kept saying to them, I was like, but what is your goal? Like, do you actually want to repair this? Because if you do, all of that stuff doesn't matter.
That's right.
It actually doesn't matter if it wasn't as bad as you thought it was, or like they're overinflating it. None of that matters if we really want repair. And I love that you said that, because I think that's the question that I left the group with. It's like, you know, when I'm brought into a lot of these situations as a consultant, by the time you bring someone like me in, it's horrible, right? like they're already risk of reputation and all these things. And then you get so much resistance from leadership. Well, it's not that bad. And like, I don't want to change our culture because we're profitable and we're growing. And it's like, it's your team. Like, do you want to keep your people or not? There's no right or wrong answer as far as I'm concerned. You can really build whatever you want to build. But if you are interested in repair, if you are interested in growth, in longevity, in safety, be willing to hear that there might be a different, better way to actually lead your teams.
Yeah, I love it. If there was one piece of advice you could give listeners to take away from your presentation, what would that be?
Yeah, the thing that's coming to mind is learning how to pause. And I say that because the competing answer would be to lead with curiosity. But I think I'm going to say pause first, because I know, you know, we all know life moves really, really quickly.
Yes.
Work is really, really quickly. You know, our economy is forcing companies and teams to be hyper productive. And there's just not enough time for us to lead with our best selves. So really learning how to pause in a moment to say, wait, what just happened? Right? Something happened. It was a blip on the radar, but something just happened, and pausing enough to actually notice something, I think to me really is the best first step, because once you notice it, you can do something about it, but we often treat these moments like fruit flies. It's like, oh, it's like, please, like I'm trying to focus on this stuff and like all this other emotional stuff is happening. So I think it's pause would be my advice, but it's closely competing with lead with curiosity.
And I'm going to give you space to talk about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I wrote this paper a while back about, and it's a concept that I didn't come up with, but it's such a powerful one about calling people in versus calling them out.
Yes.
Right? Like if you want to repair, right, and rebuild, calling people in, but that requires curiosity. Yeah. It requires an ability to say, what did you mean when you said that? Why was that funny? I missed the joke. Where's that coming from? Like, even if it's not to the individual, asking yourself, what just happened here? Like, I noticed something. And I can say this so definitively because over the course of my career, like a lot of leaders, I have built a lot of teams. And one of the things I'm most proud of, I can say this with assurance, is that I really make it my business to know the people on my team. I know them well enough that I can sense when the change happens, right? I can sense when something, even if I can't reverse engineer and understand. And so I can call someone later and be like, hey, like something happened there. Are you good? Do you want to talk? And then they'll tell me like, yeah, I didn't like the way they cut me off when I was explaining. Got it. I can understand. But that requires me being deeply curious. And I say this often, and it might be a hot take. It might not be, but I think the way promotion happens is inherently flawed, right? Like people become people leaders and managers because they're good at skills,
right?
Not because they're good at managing people. And
yes.
I say my hot take is if you don't like people, you shouldn't be a manager.
Well, I will just jump on that and say, because this is central to my own research as well, that there's enough data that actually talks about the significant harm that managers are doing to people at work.
Yeah.
And so if you don't want to do that, just know that you are actually operating against the forward movement your company is targeting.
Yeah.
Because the harming of people is stealing their passion, stealing their energy, stealing their creativity.
And it maps to that bottom line, right? Like, because, what I love about this environment is that you're in a space with people who really care about culture, which is a beautiful thing. It's just not reality, right? Like we have to now go back out into the world.
That's right.
Right? With people who are like, I can't be bothered with all this like emotional stuff, right? It's too much for me, right? But so one of the things I often try to equip people with is like, yeah, but you can map this to revenue. Like inclusive teams are more productive. They are more innovative. They make better decisions. They make those decisions faster. All of that maps to revenue.
Yes.
Right? To growth, to a stronger company and to a stronger brand. And to your point, like the harm that organizations do. And I really strongly believe this. So I love that you said this. I don't think enough people really understand the harm that they're doing by letting bad managers just exist.
That's right.
Right? Like I said to someone recently, they're like, we're going to bring in a team to help us do team building and culture. And after sitting with them for a while, I said this in sort of this moment of real honesty. I was like, the $50,000 that you're spending on that, you could save that if you just like fired that one guy. He keeps like talking to people like this, right? Like I understand that you want to build the culture, but if you keep these managers who are sitting over people, and this is why, I take this very seriously as a people leader. Like I really understand that the decisions I make contribute to their mental health, to their sense of well-being, to how they take care of their families, to how they feel on their weekends. Like, I really take that seriously. And I don't think enough people are really putting that as a major part of the job description of being a manager. And it's unfortunate because you're right. Like, the amount of damage that is done. And the sort of worst part is that people leave, right? Because there's all these stats say people leave managers, not jobs, right? But they're carrying all of this trauma with them. So then they go to the next job and they're hypersensitive.
That's right.
Because that happened the last time.
That's right.
And I learned you can't ask questions. because that's punitive and that's not safe. And so we keep harming people and then sending them out into the world. And then we wonder why folks don't enjoy work and don't enjoy like collaboration and team building. This is why.
Yeah. Oh, we could talk for hours. This was such a gift. I'm just sitting here thinking of, CultureCon's idea of making work suck less.
Yeah.
And I think if we all listened a little bit more to all the wise wisdom that you shared with us today, we'd all be a part of that. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Such a pleasure. Really, thank you.
Awesome.